Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am Tanisha Nicole Means, a faculty member at Vassar College in the Department of Political Science. I am also in the Africana Studies program and the Women's Studies program. And finally, because I like to wear multiple hats, I am a house fellow in Lathrop House or Lathrop Dorm. So I have long been interested in identity politics, particularly interested in inclusion and diversification and what that means for the work that happens within our nation's political and legal institutions. Most of my research draws on interviews and surveys with members of the public, as well as with legal actors, especially judges, to explore the interplay of race and judicial politics. I am particularly interested in addressing how and why representation matters in our courts. And so that is part of the work, or that's the work that I'm going to present today. As a teacher, I teach American politics. I try to center conversations about social and political identities and identity politics. I talk about law in courts and law in society things, but I also focus on media and popular culture and the role that the media plays in terms of American politics. But before I get into the specifics of my talk, I will share just briefly with you what motivates and sustains my work in terms of representation in the courts. For me, it really started in 2009 when I was pulled over and harassed and interrogated by a police officer because I did not have my headlights on. And so I ended up going to court to be arraigned, not because I received a $200 ticket for not having my headlights on, but because of the questions that the officer asked me during the stop, including what was my business in the neighborhood. And so that incident in 2009 really led to me being, interested in policing and justice. And then ever since the Black woman judge who was assigned to preside over that case apologized to me during my arraignment, dismissed the charges against me, and then also engaged with me about how I was feeling about everything, but also about my future and sort of my life goals. I have been interested in what it means for Black Americans and for justice, the system, to have Black judges in courthouses across this country. So my lived experiences really inform the questions that I have and the work that I do. So what does representation in the courts actually look like? You may have seen this image floating around social media and the news in November of last year. This is a group of 17 Black women from Houston or the Harris County, Texas area, who were all elected to judgeships, right? So this is great, it's phenomenal. But this also may lead to the impression that the courts must be diverse. And the reality is that they are not. What Tracy E. George and Albert Yun, two law professors, show us with this Gavel Gap report regarding judicial diversity in state courts is that white men cast too large a shadow. So while white men represent roughly 30% of the population, they represent roughly 60% of state court judges. And in fact, women of color represent 8% of state court judges, despite the fact that they represent roughly 20% of the entire US population. So clearly, judicial diversity is not what it could be, but I will say that it's much better than it was historically. And so my work on representation in the courts and specifically Black judges really adds to and contributes to conversations that are both scholarly and in the public field and realm regarding the carceral state, regarding the justice system, regarding representation in the courts, and regarding equal justice. And my work directly engages with work that focuses on representation in the legal field. So I'm thinking in particular about Black Judges of Justice by Lynn Washington and also Micah David Smith's book, Race versus Roe, that is shown here. So in my work and scholarship, I am interested in asking and trying to understand, what does it actually mean that we have Black judges? It's great that they're there, given the historical exclusion that Black people face in terms of trying to gain entry to the legal profession as attorneys, even as law students, but also as judges. So what does it mean for the system that they are now there? What does it mean for justice? What does it mean for Black people and communities that continue to be, over-policed, over-incarcerated, and also over-punished? What, if anything, can the representation of Black judges do within a system that exists with such problematic, entrenched, deeply historical racial realities? So my work, especially my current book project, takes up these questions and many others, and I join countless scholars, activists, teachers, and just human beings who are thinking about liberation, freedom, and justice. But today, since we only have a few minutes, I would like to focus on one small part of my research, and that is the work that really looks at Black judges, police encounters, policing, and the administration of justice. And so, just because this is not a murder mystery, the idea here is that policing and racial policing and police violence against Black people, these things are known to judges, right? Right now, these are salient conversations that we are having because of people like Breonna Taylor and people like George Floyd who were murdered. And that is sort of in the news. That's what we are aware of. But honestly, these kinds of conversations have been happening within the Black community for forever. Socialization has been happening around these incidents, around surviving these encounters with police. And that is just a part of regular socialization that happens within the community. So these are not new topics for Black Americans, but for many others, these are new topics with regards to racialized policing. So what does it mean that members of Black communities, right, that members of this group that have this history with policing are actually sitting on the bench in these important positions, right? What are they thinking about as they are doing their judicial work? How do their experiences as Black Americans connect to the work that they do as it relates to policing and justice administration? So the title of the talk is Black Judges, Police Encounters, and the Administration of Justice. And I think one response from my surveys that really highlight the connection and the story that I'm trying to tell is shown here. Quote, "We each bring her life experiences to work every day. It's very difficult, but we have to. We're supposed to look at the law and take the self out of it. But unfortunately, your filter, the glasses you use, are your own personal background and experience. So as a minority, I am not anti-police because I have friends who are cops, but I'm not either pro-police, that they do everything right either. I look at the situation and don't just start with a default position that they're right on everything. It's like, what are the facts? Was this a legal stop? Was it not illegal stuff? So, I question these things or those things. So this is my research team from last year, and I show them here because they, as well as a number of other students that I've worked with that I don't have pictures of, unfortunately, they have been helpful in helping me to collect the data necessary to answer the questions that I have, right? So this data collection project involves me surveying and interviewing judges from across this country. It's funded by the National Science Foundation, Vassar College, and the Ford Foundation as well. In terms of the interview responses that I'll share here, what I will say is that they came from in-depth, semi-structured interviews with 33 Black judges from across the country. These interviews range from roughly 45 minutes to almost 3 hours long. They often took place in judges' chambers or in conference rooms within courthouses. And so what I have here are just their open responses to questions that ask them about their background, their life experiences, the work that they do on the bench, issues within the courtroom and the courthouse, and sort of what they expect or need to change for them to continue doing their work. So a few notes about the data. First, Black judges are not a monolith. Still, definite trends emerge, and those are the trends that I'll share here. Second, the responses presented here are not in response to one particular question, but they really come out of the conversation that I've had with judges, right? So I've pulled their responses that relate to policing and the administration of justice. So several things emerge from the data, as I just mentioned. First, there is an awareness of racialized policing. It was clear that they understand the racial dynamics that are involved and exist within the system, that they understand disparate treatment happens depending on who you are and what community you live in. They understand mass incarceration and racial bias and the role that policing plays in terms of these two issues. They know that certain people are being adjusted, are being corrected, are being treated a certain way. And they recognize that that's not happening to all people and in all communities, that instead there's something else happening, right? Where some people are being adjusted and some people are being, arrested. Some people are being imprisoned and some people are being sort of corrected. And so there is this awareness of racialized policing that's happening. They also are aware of the discretion and power of actors and that they don't take on this responsibility of mass incarceration as only a judicial issue, but they say, listen, this is shared, right? And so what this judge says is there's a lot of discretion out here in the street. They decide what comes to us, and I think the level of discretion that they have is far greater. We don't have the same discretion, right? And so what I didn't mention from the prior slide is just that this judge was saying, in terms of awareness of racialized policing, this judge was just saying how when he goes to traffic court, and so he's sitting on the bench there, he looks out into the audience, and 90% of the individuals in the audience are Black, or 70 to 90% are Black Americans. And he says when he drives around the city, 70 to 90% of the individuals driving are not Black. So what is happening there, right? There's something happening. But what does it mean that these judges understand racialized policing, right? They look out into their courtroom and they see it, right? It's very clear to them. But they also see discretion of officers and prosecutors and other legal actors, and that they're thinking about the discretion that they have and the discretion that other actors have. So what does it mean that they understand these things and that they see the effects of racialized policing and discretion in their courtrooms in terms of all of the things that we can talk about, right? Which is racialized violence and abuse, police misconduct, community police relations. Like, what are they thinking about? So these questions raise one question that I am constantly thinking about, which is, so what, right? What can and do judges, Black judges, do about this awareness and understanding? How does this knowledge influence their work in the system? And so I'll share some of those ways, those strategies, those tactics, those actions. So first, Black judges talk about being able to understand nuance and being able to level the playing field with regards to case decisions. And so this particular judge actually mentions level the playing field. And she says, because you can see through it and you can tell when something is a driving while Black case. And so she goes on to share this story where an officer pulled over someone because he backed into his driveway. And so when the officer was asked, well, why did he pull them over and search them? Because he ended up finding some marijuana in the car, and the person asked for it to be dismissed. And the judge says, well, look, I dismissed it because the officer said, well, I stopped them because it's been my experience that when people back up in their yards, they're drug dealers, and they are doing that because it's an easy way for them to pull out. And so what she says at the end is that, I dismissed it because, wow, what a theory. People who back up in their yard are drug dealers, right? So she's talking about leveling the playing field and making decisions based on the nuance, right? The critical thinking she's doing. There's also this sense that Black judges talked about wanting to be fair and treating officers fairly. And so judges know that one major issue is that officers are afforded a type of credibility and legitimacy that even in the face of overwhelming evidence is often difficult to move other legal actors, so prosecutors and even judges, to actually see police issues, right, or to recognize police issues. So there is a type of tendency and practice that involves affording officers credibility that most people have to work for as witnesses. But for them, it's sort of a given. And so what these judges are saying here, one says, I treat them like any other witness. I know that they have the same frailties that we all have. Another judge says here, I'm mindful that officers don't always tell the truth. So when they say something that, doesn't make sense, I don't buy into it. I know that it doesn't make sense. Another way that judges sort of respond to their knowledge about racialized policing is through checking power. So we know police officers should be accountable. They should be accountable public servants, right? Who work collaboratively, transparently, and even fairly within the communities that they serve. But we know plenty of instances where police departments and police officers abuse their power by violating rules and regulations and processes and procedures. especially treating Black and Brown people as subjects of the carceral state. And so here I have a couple of examples of how Black judges talked about checking the power and holding officers to account. And so one judge just talks about being unwilling to accept the status quo. And when they see bias, call it out. Like call the chief of police. Like, I am seeing this officer and I am seeing some issues. It's one judge. Another judge says, when a young Black guy was charged with jaywalking and said, Your Honor, the officer made me take off my shoes and then open my mouth. And what she says, like, well, look, officer, really? You can't do that. We cannot violate people's rights in the interest of trying to find the bad guy, right? And so there is this, desire for them to have officers respect the law as much as the individual, or maybe even more so than individuals who may or may not be violating it, right? And when an issue arrives, they figure out how to check that power by either, what this judge says, right, dismissing the case, or in the other case, right, actually reporting it to the officer's superiors. And then finally, another action is their initiatives, right? Them wanting to collaborate and be innovative in terms of addressing racialized policing. And so here you have this judge say, look, should we have a community court that's very similar to what the Center for Court Innovation has done in New York and in other places where you have all of the agencies under one roof working to really make this person productive, right? And so what she says sort of early on is that, look, we are stuck in the status quo. And as long as we remain there, right, stuck, you're going to get the same result. That's the definition of insanity. What we have been doing doesn't work, right? And so there is this need, I think, to do something different, right? They are not happy with the current system. I asked them questions about abolition, I asked them questions about reform, and they're clear that the current system isn't what it could be and isn't what it should be. And it's going to take a lot of collaborating, a lot of innovative thinking to figure out what's the next steps. So one Black judge said this during their interview, quote, "I'm not anti-police, but I understand power and the abuse of power." And so where does this, end quote, where does this understanding come from, right? These insights and perspectives about policing and police, such as this particular thought here, are important. They signal what judges are thinking about, so that when they go to the bench and what may be in their minds, they're actually making cases when officers are being witnesses or when there's some kind of witness testimony that involves officers. And so what we just saw was that many of them have strategies and they act on their insights and perspectives. But where do those perspectives and insights come from? What really motivates these actions that these judges are taking? And so what I argue in my book is simply that, who judges are matters for the work that they do, right? When they don the Black robe and they ascend to the bench, that's important, but they're still the people who they are without the robe, right? And they have life experiences, they have embodied experiences, and they have vicarious experiences via themselves being Black, being in Black communities, having Black family members, but also being in the legal field and being insiders, right? So they're able to witness what happens behind the scenes. And I think that is also revealing to them. So I think their experiences really influence the work that they do and their actions. So there are judges who share their personal experiences with policing, and believe it or not, this was a huge thing and very surprising for me, but perhaps maybe not, it should not have been surprising. But they talk about their personal experiences with policing. They've had their own driving while Black experiences. They had their own racial profiling experiences, their interrogation experiences, their coercion experiences, and so on. And so this particular judge has shared how she had been pulled over by the police when she was an attorney. And she says, this experience made me question a lot, right? So I always question a lot of stuff. And because of that experience, I am very skeptical, right? And she's really referring to hearing that officers are taught to write reports backward to make items fit, but also that officers can lie and say that they were given permission to do something when really they were not, right? There's also these vicarious experiences that judges talk about with policing. So one is sort of growing up in a Black community, right? And so understanding things with nuance. So here the judge is talking about, quote, "If you tell me so-and-so is a flight risk because he ran from the police, Well, you know, in my neighborhood, when you see the police coming, you get nervous and you run. Does that mean that you're a flight risk? Not necessarily, because you ain't got nowhere to go. You got no passport. You got no, you know. You understand what I'm saying. So my interpretation is informed by my experience. My upbringing informs me to question. There's also judges who talk about vicarious experience via, you know, uh, living in two neighborhoods, right? Experiencing policing that happens disparately depending on where you are located. And so this particular judge lived in a black community for part of his childhood and then lived in a white community for part of his childhood. And he witnessed how police acted differently. And so for him, he said, it led him this understanding led him to know that officers do make decisions that are based on things other than objective factors, right? He recognized that a lot of the decisions that were made by the police officers were based on race and sort of not based on other things. And then finally, there are vicarious experiences via who people are related to, right? So vicarious experiences as family members. So here you have this judge talking about their siblings' experience with policing and how, you know, it helps to give her a better understanding in terms of police relations, right? She says, you know, my sibling was arrested by the police and my sibling was handcuffed to a chair. A German shepherd pawed him and they're like, where are the drugs? He filed a civil lawsuit and the judge says that that could not have happened. It was unbelievable, but I know my brother wouldn't lie. So I know that happened. I know he called me right when it happened when he was in jail, but he was profiled and they thought he was a drug dealer and he wasn't, right? He says, she says, you know, a little bit earlier is that it gives a better understanding because you will have some people who feel that the police don't lie. I know for a fact they do, right? And she knows that because of this vicarious experience. So what do we have? Right? We have a number of judges who have these strategies and actions regarding policing and sort of this awareness also. And sort of what does all of this mean? I mean, I think the work, the interviews, they show how representation can matter, that these judges are going to the bench and sort of doing important work and making important decisions that sort of work to adjust and the balance a bit or make things a bit more fair and balanced. But the question is it enough? And while I think the judges that I interview can have a local impact, influencing the cases that they preside over, they can even influence their judicial colleagues, they can influence the officers in their area, they can influence the decisions and policies that happen within their courthouse and perhaps even their jurisdiction. But I think in terms of having substantial, transformative, universal change on a large scale, right, in terms of the broader justice system, I think that having these Black judges do this work, while important, is not enough, right? For one thing, there's a few of them. There's only a few of them, as I showed in the earlier slide. Another thing is that they are not a monolith. So this presentation is not trying to say that all judges feel this way. But again, these are some of the trends. And moreover, right, Black judges and Black people didn't create these issues. So I think it's a bit naive to think that they should somehow that they should somehow, their labor is going to adjust or correct them or resolve them. And then I think finally, the big thing is that, individual actions rarely address systemic structural issues, and racialized policing represent such an issue. These are structural, deeply historical, entrenched issues that are very complex. And so by the time cases come to a judge, I think it's really hard for them to make decisions that really address racialized policing and sort of what happens. So in conclusion, Black judges' histories and experiences are not just abstract things, right? Their experiences and perspectives go with them to the bench, even when they don the Black robe, when they walk across the courtroom to get to their bench. It all informs their work. So what these judges do on the bench helps them to address and deal with some policing issues, but it's not a cure, right? And if I had to say that there was one takeaway point from this work, I would say it is the fact that one cannot truly understand and study why judges behave the ways they do without understanding who judges are, right? So centering their backgrounds, their socialization, their life experiences, and so on. I also want to make it clear that Black judges are not unique, that they are not uniquely affected by their experiences and socialization, but that we can expect that other judges, white judges, and other judges to be also influenced by their life experiences and their upbringings and their lives. So again, donning the black robe, the judicial robe, and rising to the bench does not mean that you go there as a blank slate. In fact, as James Wan, a federal judge, said in an article that he published some years ago about judicial independence, he said, quote, "Judges don't come to the court as tabula rasa," end quote. If they, and for me, I think it's the fact that they absolutely bring the full weight of who they are to their position in the judiciary, and that is why representation matters. That's why it's important. So I sincerely thank you for listening to this presentation that was supposed to be 20 minutes, and I see that it's like 25 minutes. So bear with me. As I mentioned earlier, this work is part of a larger project, a book project that should be coming out in a few years. And so, yeah, I'm really excited about this work. It's important work. And of course, I would say that, but I think it's generally important because these types of questions are understudied in the literature. If you have questions or just want to chat about this work, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is here in red, tmeans@vassar.edu. If you are a student or prospective student, please be, I guess, excited because this kind of work is what I bring into my classroom, showing data, talking about data, sharing these things that are not yet fully published in the literature, but are important to providing a more comprehensive understanding about judicial diversity. And I'd also like to conclude by sharing the significance of these images that have been repeated throughout. These images are it's artwork by Ted Ellis, a Black artist who has done a number of pieces regarding Black Americans in the legal field. And so for me, how I came across his work is that these images appeared repeatedly in Black judges' chambers, and I kept seeing them. And so, of course, as a researcher, I'm like, tell me more, let me research this. And so I ended up finding these other pieces. But, for me, I think seeing these images in their courtrooms and the fact that they're even there, right, I think that it sends also a signal that they are normalizing and that they see themselves as playing an important role on the bench, that there's value to their presence, and they're normalizing representation in all of the various ways in the legal system, right? So from the attorneys that's sort of standing there in the room to the diversity amongst people in the jury box, to the judge that's sitting on the bench or even shuffling across the floor, right? So I, again, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you are leaving with a bit more information about the courts and about judges and Black judges in particular and the work that they are doing in our system. And I hope that in whatever way that is possible in your own life, that you can find a way to support diversifying the bench. There are a number of initiatives, and so I hope that you seek them out. I hope that you think about this work sort of leaving here, that it's not just information that you have obtained, but it's information that you think about and that you act on. Because again, representation is so important for justice and for dealing with many of the issues that we recognize are within the system. So take good care and thanks again.